Blog theory. Feedback and capture in the circuits of Drive-Polity. By Jodi Dean. 2010. Chapter 3. Whatever blogging. Section 1. In 2007, e-commerce types were agog at the success of American teenager Ashley Quiles. By the time she was 17, she was making over $1 million a year from whateverlife.com, the busy pink website she designed to market MySpace page layouts. Market is not quite the right word, though. Her layouts and add-ons weren't for sale. They were free. Her income came from advertising. Because whateverlife.com gets more than 60 million hits a month, exceeding the circulation of several of the most popular English-language teen magazines combined, it supplies advertisers with a valuable commodity, the eyeballs of teenage girls. Quiles, or Ashbo as she calls herself, started whateverlife.com in 2004. By 2007, she had expanded her site into something close to a community for girls, a go-to site where girls could find tutorials for making their own layouts as well as a variety of images, banners, captions, buttons, and boxes for decorating their MySpace pages. In addition to the revenue-generating ads, whateverlife.com, with its growing staff of writers and designers, features a magazine and a link to Ashbo's blog on her MySpace page. Although Quiles' popularity is exceptional, her profile fits the dominant one for US bloggers. She is under 30 and female. The Pew Internet and American Life Project report on teens and social media provides some context. Only 8% of adult Internet users in the US have created a blog, but 28% of online teens blog, and these are most likely to be girls. Describing her site as a place to express yourself, Quiles repeats the reason most US bloggers give for blogging: a wish to express herself creatively. There were other awards too, however. By 2007 she was earning enough from whateverlife.com to drop out of high school and purchase a house. Ashbo explains how she came up with a name for her site. Quotation by Ashbo. Whateverlife.com is simply put as an inside joke. It then developed into something else, as for whatever life you lead, meaning there would be information and fun things for anyone and everyone. Which is why I'm always expanding in content, as much as I can. Or, for the long story, a night at Breeze back in 2004, playing Mario Party 2 or 3, we both lost to computer characters. I think DK was on easy, so I throw the controller down and walk off. On my way, I say whatever, life, as sarcastically as possible. Then I started thinking about how neat of a website name it would be. Here it is. Big smiley emoji. End of quotation by Ashbo. Whatever sprouts up all over the new media environment. Sightings include a blog by writer John Scalzi, a music video called United States of Whatever, by Liam Lynch, as well as its remixes into cartoons of George W. Bush responding to comments that could suggest disagreement with his policies with the phrase whatever. This is my United States of Whatever, multiple home video clips of babies saying whatever on YouTube, and a show called Whatever with Alexis and Jennifer on the Martha Stewart channel on Sirius Satellite Radio. The show features the Whatever Girls, Stewart's daughter, Alexis, and her friend, Jennifer Koppelman-Hutt, the daughter of Stewart's producer. In addition to their radio show, the Whatever Girls have blogs, bulletin boards, and an online shop for buying whatever merchandise. Whatever is also the title of a 1998 movie about teens in the pre-AIDS 80s, directed by Susan School, and an internationally acclaimed novel by Michel Houellebecq, published in French in 1988. Ashley Quiles provides an image of blogging as a popular technological practice of content production, media use, and multiple platform integration inscribed into everyday life such that there is little difference between being on or offline. Together with the statistical snapshots provided by the Pew Internet and American Life Project, this image might let us feel like we are accessing a truth about blogs and social networks. They are by and for teenage girls. Both produce effective spaces where they express themselves, share their feelings, and reach out with a little hope that someone will be touched and reach back. Accessed through the intense emotional world of networked adolescence, blogs aren't confined to a sphere separate from other media. They are situated in a rich communicative habitat consisting of multiple platforms and applications, mobile phones, social network sites, video, music, and photo sharing sites. Blogs seem, then, to be ways that any one of us could report on, share, experience, and even market our social lives. With a little luck, we could even earn revenue on ads accompanying each and every heartfelt expression. Feelings can be profitable. Section 2. The image constituted through the combination of statistics and the experience of a single blogger is too easy, even as it highlights the juxtaposition between the singular and the many characteristic of contemporary networked media. Rather than relying on one to stand in for an impossible whole, we do better to consider the rise of personalized media as a mass phenomenon in practice. By 2008, there were from 80 to 120 million blogs. The overwhelming majority of these blogs appear and die in a matter of months, having been seen by few if any readers. Blogs are many and innumerable, an open, changing set of unique expressions. At the same time, the standardization supplied by blog services, the basic page layouts, archival features, titles, banners, ads, and widgets, formats blogs as ultimately interchangeable, the same, one virtually indistinguishable from another. An easy test, from the Blogger dashboard, www.blogger.com, click on the next blogger link, repeat again and again. You'll move through various blogs in various languages, seemingly at random. I've encountered blogs featuring photos of horse hoofs and how to care for them, travel photos, old watches, pie recipes, wedding preparations. On my screen, configured within Blogger's range of possible layouts, the blogs blend into and substitute one for another. The common format that makes blogs blogs is a condition for the unique productions of singular bloggers. And vice versa, without the unique offerings, indeed, the promise that each voice can be heard, each experience documented, each opinion expressed, blogging has no point. We can approach this same entanglement from a different direction. Blogs offer exposure and anonymity at the same time. As bloggers we expose ourselves, our feelings and experiences, loves and hates, desires and aversions. Yet we often write as if we've opened ourselves to nearly no one, to just a select few, to a small community of those we trust, perhaps because we cannot see them. Knowing full well that we are one among millions, we may find ourselves relieved not to have so many hits, so many comments. Strangers and opponents remind us of our exposure, our visibility, vulnerability, and ultimate lack of control. After I gave a talk as part of a symposium on evil at MIT, a neo-Nazi found my blog, I cite. He wrote, quotation, "You live in an environment where debate is not free, and your half-witted ideas are protected and allowed an existence that exposure to reason would not accord them. You imply here that you are being criticized because you criticized Bush. No. You are being criticized because you sounded stupid while criticizing Bush. God, what do you think of the world? Do you think there are some politically correct blog police that are going to stop people from criticizing you, like they do at your university? In the United States there is a First Amendment, and just like the First Amendment allows you to prattle on like a moron with vapid ideas that no real person takes seriously, it allows people to point out that your ideas are vapid and you're prattling on like a moron. Not everyone has to be nice to you, not everyone has to agree with you, and your extreme pathological reaction to criticism is disturbing. You are not fully developed psychologically, and I strongly recommend you quit your job and go out into the real world to toughen up a bit. Because if you can't debate a few easy criticisms, at some point, the real world will eat you. Even the moron claiming I'm a racist slumlord is doing better than you." End of quotation. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. It's as if his remarks momentarily shattered the presumptions and expectations that enabled me to write so openly, exposing their specificity, their fragility, their context dependency, confronting me with the fact that my fantasized audience was not my real one. Blogs can be useful political tools. They let activists report on their activities, plans, and aspirations. They help them meet up and coordinate. At the same time, they deliver a lot of knowledge to activists' opponents, the university officials wanting to know which students are responsible for the sit-in, The law enforcement officials trying to diminish the impact of planned demonstrations, to discourage activists from going too far. Privacy and consumer protection advocates remind us of the accumulation of data on consumers, data easily mined for the sake of the increasingly specific and personalized targeting of ads. Yet this information in need of protection is the open content of millions of blogs and social network profiles. Blogs make monitoring easy. There's no need to spy. I'll tell you everything, and more. In short, blogging relies on a fantasy of exposure without exposure correlative to the indistinguishable mass of the singularly unique. It's like the thrill of telling a secret without being burdened by anxiety over its being told, exposure without exposure. Social networks like MySpace and Facebook deploy a similar fantasy. One can share one's life with one's friends without repercussion. On the one hand, because one has specifically friended those in one's network, one can rest assured that one's secrets are safe. If you can't trust your friends, who can you trust? On the other, the drive to grow one's network. Look, I'm somebody. I've got thousands of friends, they like me, they really like me. To friend people with whom one works, people from different parts of one's life, belies the illusion of control over one's personal information. Not only is one's data shared with third parties, but the surveys and games that flourish in social network environments expand third-party access. Access to my friend is a way of getting access to me. A typical Facebook profile reveals a person's name, age, birthday, location, occupation, high school and/or university, relationship status, sexual orientation, political affiliation, religion, and personal appearance. Add to this the fact that most users mention events they attend, groups to which they belong, causes they support, and the result is a heavy degree of exposure. Typically, we respond to these seemingly paranoid lines of thought with deflection. It isn't me about whom data is collected, it's us, an aggregate. It's our patterns, not mine. It's how many of us refer to a new movie or click on an ad, not whether I do. As with blogging, our participation in social networks relies on the supposition that we expose but are not exposed, that we are unique but ultimately indistinguishable. Section 3. Developing a notion offered by Giorgio Agamben, Dominic Petman considers the problem of the interchangeable yet irreplaceable in terms of whatever being. For Petman, as for Agamben, whatever being points to new modes of community and new forms of personality anticipated by the dissolution of inscriptions of identity through citizenship, ethnicity, and other modern markers of belonging. Describing the character actor as exemplary of whatever being, Petman glosses the concept as an enactment of existence without qualities, or at least qualities so interchangeable and obvious that they erase all identity. In positive terms, whatever being is a tag for the sheer generic potentiality of being. Agamben emphasizes that the whatever in whatever being relates not to singularity as indifference to a common property but only in its being such that it is. Quotation by Agamben. In this conception, such and such being is reclaimed from its having this or that property, which identifies it as belonging to this or that set, to this or that class, the Reds, the French, the Muslims, and it is reclaimed not for another class nor for the simple generic absence of any belonging, but for its being such, for belonging itself. Thus being such, which remains constantly hidden in the condition of belonging, there is an X such that it belongs to Y, and which is in no way a real predicate, comes to light itself. The singularity exposed as such is whatever you want, that is lovable. End of quotation by Agamben. There is belonging, but not to anything in particular. Something in particular is insofar as it belongs. Asking to what? Petman and Agamben suggest, mistakenly prioritizes the set over the very condition of belonging. What matters is belonging, not that to which one belongs. At the same time, mattering triggers an intervention into what could seem little more than another way of designating indifference. Mattering matters. It's the interjection or scission of love and desire, of wanting. What matters stands out from the mass or multiple because it matters. As Petman suggests, that I love it, desire it, separates it from the endless, open, uncountable set of indistinguishable members. There are over 100 million blogs. At least one of them is mine. Section 4. In U.S. popular vernacular, whatever is an effective, verbal response that deflects another's comment. It is generally uttered in response not to a question, but to a statement or observation through which another might be attempting to harness the recipient or hearer. You haven't cleaned your room. Whatever. One of multiple video mashups of Liam Lynch's punk pop Whatever combines images of George W. Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, Lynch's guitar tracks, and a Bush impersonation voiceover. Bush yells, "I'm George W. Bush, leader of the free world. I want to bomb Iraq. And when the world says, no, I say, whatever. Saddam has started to meet our demands. Yeah, whatever." He sings the refrain, "'Cause this is my United States of whatever." The response whatever registers the fact of another utterance, of a communicative effort or engagement. It acknowledges communicativity through the deflection of the communicative effort. The sender's message, whether understood in terms of its content or its intent, whether conscious or unconscious, is neither accepted nor rejected. Rather, the whatever response distills the message into the simple fact of utterance. Whatever resembles the response of Herman Melville's Bartleby, the scrivener who replies, "I would prefer not to" when given a task or instruction. For some contemporary philosophers, for example, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, Bartleby provides a figure of refusal, opposition, or resistance, a model of escape or disentanglement from the relations of power constitutive of contemporary capitalist control societies. The argument is premised on power's dependence on resistance. The transgression of the law calls law into being. Or, protesters need police brutality in order to demonstrate the validity of their protests. Bartleby, then, suggests a way out of the dialectic of law and its transgression. Sidestepping resistance, he deprives power of its hold. Yet even as Bartleby evades the circuit of power and resistance by refusing to refuse, he continues to rely on his position as a singular subject. He says "I," referring to himself as a subject, and not just any subject, but a subject with a view, a preference. As such, he remains exposed to power. He still cares. In response to a request, Bartleby does more than acknowledge communication, the fact that a message has been delivered and received. His answer affirms the intelligibility of the request even as it challenges the normative expectations informing it. And rather than challenging the sender of the message's authority to make the request he makes, Bartleby asserts himself as what matters. He would prefer not to. He is a subject with preferences, and these preferences must be attended to. In contrast, the only affirmation in whatever is of communication as such. Another has communicated. This communication in no way obligates me as the recipient of the message. By responding whatever, I have signaled the minimum degree of awareness of communicative being. A message is sent in expectation of a response. After all, I didn't completely ignore you. Whatever asserts no preferences. It neither affirms nor rejects. And it doesn't expose the subject as a desiring subject to whom something matters. There is also an affective dimension to whatever, an insolence or attitude or provocation that arises out of its function as a non-responsive response. By acknowledging communication without attending to the content of the message, whatever denies the sender the sense that her message has been received because its content remains unaddressed. The sender is challenged, her position as sender undermined. Whatever forestalls a communicative exchange even as it adopts communicative form. It refrains from establishing the subject position of the one who responds with whatever, and it unsettles the position of the one who initiates the exchange. It's a glitch in orality. If communicativity such that it is, whatever communicativity, tags forms of subjectivity and belonging discernible in contemporary media practices, who and what is likely to benefit? What kinds of political and economic relations are likely to flourish in these new communicative habitats? Whatever it takes. Section 5. By now an extensive literature exists documenting the production of national identities through media and communication technologies. Susan Buck-Morss's Dreamworld and Catastrophe is one of the best contributions to this research. Buck-Morss explores the mass identities of utopian and project-based states such as the United States and the Soviet Union during the 20th century. She highlights the dreams and fantasies enabled by the movies, the imaginings of collectivity that film incited. For communists and capitalists alike, 20th-century technological projects were also identity projects. 4 components of Buck-Morss's account are particularly compelling: Mass media's direct addressing of society, the way mass media changed the nature of crowds, the spectacular function of mass media, and the compensatory logic of mass media's organization of space. First, many have noted the ways mass media address, masses. Radio brought leaders' voices directly into people's homes, integrating leaders into their intimate spaces. Broadcast television likewise occupied a domestic space as it addressed its audience as personal members of a nation, perhaps imagined like a family. Respected newscaster Walter Cronkite was affectionately referred to as Uncle Walt. But film in particular, with its large screen and grand scale, organized and spoke to the masses as a collective. The nation as national society is produced through the media address, whether newspaper, radio, television, or film, with no existence as such prior to this address. Second, in a nuanced reading of the role of film production in the US and USSR during the 1930s, Buck Morse observes. Quotation by Buck Morse. Whereas the radio voice allowed mass identification with political leaders, cinema, traveling to towns and villages to meet audiences halfway, represented a moving image of the masses that allowed audiences to recognize themselves. Such mirroring can be important in transforming the accidental crowd, mass in itself, into the self-conscious, purposeful crowd, the mass for itself, with at least the potential of acting out its own destiny. End of quotation by Buck Morse. Unlike the moving carnival, whose spectators aggregate and disperse, cinema organizes, locates, and seats its spectators. Their attention is directed to a single place, to the screen. The unity of the screen produces out of the disunity of persons a singular audience that can see and recognize itself as a collective. We are watching this movie. For the Soviets, the films of Sergei Eisenstein played a particularly powerful role. Eisenstein captured and glorified intense scenes of revolutionary masses, images that became the memories of the October Revolution. Buck Morse writes, the particular characteristics of the screen as a cognitive organ enabled audiences to see the materiality not only of the new collective protagonist, but also of other ideal entities, the unity of the revolutionary people, the idea of international solidarity, the idea of the Soviet Union itself. Similarly, in the United States, cinema changed the nature of the crowd by providing an imaginary mass body. In the early 20th century US, ethnic groups, religions, political organizations, and racist law worked against the image and goal of a unified political identity. Film countered these forces, offering massive cinematic bodies as points of singular identification. It was a crucial vehicle for mass assimilation via the production of a common culture and collective experience. And as Buck Morse emphasizes, the potential power of this new collectivity was enormous, whether as a force of production, consumption, or politics. Third, Buck Morse points out the potential for manipulation in cinema. In an argument reminiscent of Guy Debord's critique of the society of the spectacle, she notes how both Hollywood and Soviet cinema affirmed official culture and denied certain bleak realities of social development. The former presented dream versions of commodity consumption. Monumental stars, awesome production numbers, Busby Berkeley, and special effects, King Kong, and luxurious lifestyles captivated Depression-era audiences and attempted to channel their desire toward fantasies of consumption. The latter idealized production. Although Soviet film in the 20s continued the avant-garde experimentation of the revolutionary period, which was itself heavily influential in the US, even as it imported Hollywood movies, by the 30s socialist realism and the glorification of collective projects was culturally dominant. The chief of Swar's Kino, Soviet cinema, Boris Shumyatsky, rejected Soviet art cinema as overvaluing formalism and aesthetics. A better model for socialist realism could be found in Hollywood, which employed a factory-like model of artistic production and a realistic style of joyful spectacles accessible to the masses. One of the most successful Soviet films of this period was Chapayev, an action movie about the defeat of the White Russians in the Civil War that out-Westerned the Hollywood movies it was modeled on. Finally, the fourth aspect of Buck Morse's discussion of the role of film in the production and imagining of mass national identities important for my argument is the division between public and private spheres. Here the Soviet and US cultural imaginaries are inversions of each other. The space that for one was a fantasized site of fulfillment was for the other a site of drudgery. The forced intimacy of the communal apartment was a particular kind of terror affecting the most banal practices of every day, Buckmorse explains. Insofar as public life under Stalinism was itself presented as the location of purpose and fulfillment, there was no need for retreat into a private domain. Conversely, in the US, factory work generally appeared as a particularly brutal, humiliating kind of labor. Workers were subjected to control, subjection, the daily constraints and degradations of the assembly line. Rather than a source of fulfillment, industrial work was necessary drudgery. In return, workers received compensation in the form of consumption, enjoying consumer goods in the context of the love and warmth of the nuclear family. Buckmorse writes, the ideology of the private home came to bear a tremendous burden, that of legitimating the entire system of industrial capitalism, and nowhere more so than in the United States. Section 6. What fantasies, what possibilities, what kinds of subjects, do multiply intersecting and increasingly personalized media and communication technologies stimulate? Differently put, how might changes from the media constitutive of projects of national utopian imagination lead in the direction of whatever beings? The pleasures of parallels with Buckmorse's discussion of film and national mass identities suggest that answers might be found in at least 4 domains. First, if mass media addressed society directly, organizing and speaking to masses as collectives, contemporary networked communications have multiple addressees known and unknown, friends and strangers. Bloggers may write for others whom they imagine share their interests, a group of the uninformed they might enlighten, or future versions of themselves. The set of friends who receive my updates on Facebook, my network, are uniquely mine. Each user's network is different, even as they overlap and intersect. Blogs and social networks do not provide broadly shared symbolic identities from which we see ourselves. Blogs don't address society writ large. They invite singular readers to consider what they have on offer. Or they just make themselves available to be found by search engines crawlers. Unlike mass media's calling of collectives, publics, and nations into being, blogs don't unite bloggers and readers. To this extent, they are more like pencils than cinema. They remain specific in their multiplicity. Second, whereas mass media made crowds visible to themselves as a unity, providing the crowd with an imaginary collective body, networked communication and entertainment makes particularities visible to themselves as particularities. I can tweet my current location, update my friends on my current mood, check what's trending. With multiply convergent and turbulent media, I don't have to settle on any one direction or theme. I can live in the momentary. Not only do these multiple, circulating impulses incite in me a kind of permanent indecision or postponement, a lack of commitment, what else is out there? But the fragmenting, networking, thrust of drive turns my particular body, my very face, into a montage, a wrinkle here, a bump there, a nose too large, lips too small. Fortunately, I can update my photo at any time, and I can animate it, too. There is no us. There is no me, although I can Google myself to see if I turn up. Buckmorse argues that cinema creates an imagined space where a mass body exists that can exist nowhere else. My point is that blogs, standing in for the networked information and entertainment media of communicative capitalism, not only do not create such a space for a mass body but dissolve any sense of it. They displace it, producing instead ever-accelerating circuits of images, impulses, fragments, and feelings. Blogs cannot be counted, they resist inclusion into sets or categories. Yes, cinema still exists and sometimes it lets us feel ourselves as something like an us, and then I can tweet about it. Blog mapping projects attempt to make multiple disparate blogs appear as a sphere, a collective, as points in a shared space. But the space they map is in the imaginary of the researcher, not in bloggers' presence to themselves as a collective. Third, the cinematic spectacles produced by Hollywood and the Soviet Union in the 1930s generally sought to affirm official culture and deny the grimmer aspects of economic and social life. In contrast, blogs persist in a setting of total mediality. Anything can be found, said, seen on the internet. With publicity as the ideology of communicative capitalism, everything can be said, nothing need be denied. Every aspect of contemporary life is reflected upon, criticized, mocked, and then the reflections, criticisms, and mockeries are themselves reflected upon, criticized, mocked, Did we go too far? In this setting, nothing is unworthy of comment or commentary. Every aspect of the ordinary and everyday matters to someone, for like a second. Blogs say that whatever happens to me matters, in and of itself. And in this reflexive environment, even the fact that my posts are boring, that the arguments in my little segment of the blog archipelago have an intensity far beyond merit, that the escapades of celebrities captured by TMZ are trivial, even all these facts are known and discussed. Most of the time, the repetitive intensities of blog drama are inversions of politics, rapidly circulating differences and modulations that ensure that nothing changes. Sometimes the intensities accumulate, punctuated by catastrophic events, which are both creative and destructive. Markets boom and bust, terrorists attack, a children's book becomes a global sensation. The circuits adjust and recalibrate, capturing the new again in the snares of communicative capitalism. Fourth, just as the official myth of fulfillment through factory labor collapsed with the end of Stalinism, people didn't have to pretend anymore that it was true, they still had to go to work. The myth of idealized domesticity crumpled in the US, in part because of the achievements of feminism, in part because the realities of divorce, infidelity, addiction, and abuse made its fantasy impossible to sustain. Television and feminism both made the personal political, erasing the fragile and imaginary boundaries between public and private, a line that made little sense after the rise of the social. In the remnants of the myth of idealized domesticity, ideals of individual freedom and creativity are promoted. Personal satisfaction takes the place of familial duty. Differently put, family life is supposed to be personally rewarding, rather than a duty or expectation. When family life fails to satisfy, it is examined and diagnosed, offered remedies and supplements. The family better succeed because the brutal competition of neoliberalism offers neither shelter nor respite. Communicative capitalism provides the form and vehicle for the individualized consumption, participation, and creative needs expression of subjects compelled to be personally satisfied. Correlative to the erasure of the always tenuous distinction between the public and private spheres is the dissolution of the boundary between work and play. From the initial electronics boom in the 70s through the larger shifts associated with personal computers and the Internet, informatization has promised those who work with symbols and ideas increased ease and comfort. Early versions celebrated telecommuting and the paperless office. Later versions preyed on fears of being left behind, out of the loop, not as quick as the competition. Consultants urged corporations to restructure work, to encourage creativity and team building, to make work more like play. At the same time, with ever more games and interactions moving online, onto screens, play seemed a little more like work. In the circuits of communicative capitalism, the repetitions of Drive suggest work without work, in the forms of work without pay or work that is fun, and play without play, in the forms of play for which one is paid and play for which one pays with enjoyment. This, then, is the setting wherein blogs are not escapes from the drudgery of part of one's life. They are not fantastic experiments in virtual reality. Rather, blogs instead extend out from, amplify, and reflect on whatever aspect of whatever life. Section 7. The change marked by the end of the Cold War has been tagged the end of ideology, the end of the Keynesian welfare state, the decline of the Fordist model of production, and the beginning of globalization, the information age, the network society, communicative capitalism. In their account of the new formation, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri accentuate the passage from disciplinary society to the society of control. Focusing on the capitalist societies of the US, UK, and Europe, they point out how disciplinary logics worked primarily within the institutions of civil society to produce subjects. By the end of the 20th century, these mediating institutions, the nuclear family, the prison, the school, the union, and the local church, were in crisis. The spaces, logics, practices, and norms previously coalescing into social and economic institutions have broken down and apart. Their efficacy is now indeterminate. In other words, in some instances, the release of an institutional logic from its spatial constraints has given it all the more force. In other instances, the opposite has occurred. Corresponding to this pervasive dissolution and indeterminacy, which itself necessarily correlates with the economic changes of informatization and the ubiquitous spread of networked communications, is an indeterminacy of the form of the subjectivities produced. Hart and Negri argue that the old political subject, the citizen subject of an autonomous political sphere, the disciplined subject of civil society, the liberal subject willing to vote in public and then return home to his private domesticity, can no longer serve as a presupposition of theory or action. Racial, ethnic, and sexual identifications are similarly less fixed, less stable, less available as determinate subject positions. In their place, we find fluid, hybrid, and mobile subjectivities who are undisciplined, who have not internalized specific norms and constraints, and who can now only be controlled. Expressed in psychoanalytic terms, symbolic identity is increasingly meaningless in the society of control. What we have instead are imaginary identities sustained by excess jouissance, by an injunction to enjoy. More specifically, symbolic identity involves the subject's identification with an ego ideal, a perspective before whom the subject sees himself and his actions. Imaginary identification refers to the image that the subject adopts of himself. Symbolic identification, we might say, establishes the setting that determines which images appear and how it is that some are more compelling or attractive to us than others. Imaginary identification refers only to my self-image. In disciplinary society, normative expectations coalesced around determinate social roles. Presuming the gaze of the school, church, family, or state, one could imagine oneself in different positions that would either comply with or transgress institutional norms. I can be a conscientious student, faithful believer, dutiful daughter, good citizen. And I can also be a delinquent, backsliding, worthless, traitor. Even as the images differ, the symbolic identity of the gaze remains the same. In the wake of the decline of symbolic efficiency, the dissolution of disciplinary society, this gaze loses its prior force. We aren't sure if it's operative, if others believe it. Is the good student a cog, uncreative, thinking inside the box, a goody two-shoes? Does the other actually admire and applaud transgression, and if so, is it then more transgressive not to be transgressive since that's what the other wants? Encountering the endless possibilities of contemporary reflexivity, post-disciplinary subjects are propelled to move through a variety of imaginary identities. We imagine ourselves one way, then another, never sure of how we appear because we don't know before whom we appear. Lacking the ability to imagine how we appear to another, how another sees us, we lose the capacity to take the position of another, to see or think from another's perspective. We can choose any identity, but we lack the grounds for choosing or the sense that an identity, once chosen, entails bonds of obligation. Rather than following norms, which ones? How do they know? Who made them the expert? We cycle through trends, whether these come from fashion, diet advice, or the hope for an anchor in a particular subculture. A striking example of the dissolution of norms in the inability to take the perspective of another is regularly performed on amateur talent shows like American Idol, Britain's Got Talent, and So You Think You Can Dance? Upon hearing a judge's negative assessment of his or her performance, the contestant says something to the effect of, "Well, that's just your opinion, I know I have talent." The oddness is that this response seems rooted in a failure to understand the very practice of judging and competition in talent shows. At any rate, the society of control places limits on the mobility and fluidity of contemporary hybrid identities, but these limits are not those installed by a master signifier or symbolic law. To this extent, they are experienced by subjects as either groundless intrusions, irrational barriers to enjoyment, the American Idol version, Simon Cowell is simply cruel, or as hypothetical or instrumental injunctions, as means for achieving enjoyment later. Caught in reflexive networks, always another move, another level, we lose the capacity for reflection. Our networks are reflexive so that we don't have to be. We are not bloggers. We are not Facebook. The networked interactions of communicative capitalism do not provide symbolic identities, sites from which we see ourselves as loci of collective action. Rather, they provide opportunities for new ways for me to imagine myself, a variety of lifestyles that I can try on. This variety and mutability makes my imaginary identity extremely vulnerable. The frames of reference that give it meaning and value are forever shifting. The others who can rupture it might appear at any moment, and their successes, their achievements, their capacities to enjoy call mine into question. I could have had more, I could have really enjoyed. This insecurity is not only psychic, it's a reasonable response to struggles to persist in global, reflexive financial and information networks. Most of the economic benefits of neoliberal capitalism, of the new economy celebrated by digital media gurus, follow a power law distribution. A lucky few will get nearly everything. Most will get very little, almost nothing. Hart and Negri describe the ungovernable, mobile, and fluid singularities arising in the aftermath of disciplinary subjectivity in terms of an anthropological exodus. Hence, they emphasize that those who are against empire's exploitation and domination must also continually attempt to construct a new body and a new life. Communicative capitalism facilitates and incites these attempts, employing ever innovative upgrades to ensure not just that the attempts continue but that they accelerate. Hart and Negri acknowledge that the methods of anthropological exodus are the methods of empire. But they don't accept that their response is also empire's: do more, go further, radicalize, create something new, make tools into prostheses, migrate and mutate into information technologies. They write, the will to be against really needs a body that is completely incapable of submitting to command. An undisciplined body incapable of submission is a body of immediacy and enjoyment, driven to move from image to image, intensity to intensity. Lacking discipline, how can it resist? How can it form a will at all? Far from constructing something new, such a body forecloses the possibility and hope of self-governance. Networked media in the society of control amplify the challenge post-Fordism poses to collective identity. Yes, they enable people to sign petitions. Yes, they enable people to give money. Yes, they enable people to express their opinions. Yes, Obama had like 1 million Facebook friends. But these particular motions of clicking and linking do not produce symbolic identities. They are ways that I express myself, just like shopping, checking my friends' updates, or following tabloid news at tmz.com. I may imagine others like me, a virtual local, but this local remains one of those like me, my linked list or followers, those who fit my demographic profile, my user habits. I don't have to posit a collective of others with whom I might need to cooperate or struggle, to whom I might be obliged, others who might place demands on me. The instant connection of networked association allows me to move on as soon as I am a little uncomfortable, a little put out. Petitions, social network groups, the one on Facebook that aims to get 1 million people to say they oppose capitalism has 24,672 members. Blogs, they are the political equivalent of just-in-time production, quick responses circulating as contributions to the flows of communicative capitalism. In her compelling analysis of flash mobs, Kaylee Sorokin takes the argument even further. Countering enthusiastic appropriations of flash mobs as new instances of democratic engagement, Sorokin presents them as instances of the fetishizing of pure participation removed from any meaningful political project. She concludes, hopes that flash mobs might represent a future form of political organization reflect a desire for a politics of convenience where getting together with others is easy and does not involve conflict, commitment and struggle. In the circuits of communicative capitalism, convenience trumps commitment. Section 8. Agamben affiliates whatever being with the capitalist commodification of the human body and the technologization of its image in the spectacle. The photographic images proliferating out of advertising and pornography are neither generic nor individual, neither an image of the divinity nor an animal form. In them, the body now became something truly whatever. The whatever Agamben invokes here suggests a new approach to Guy Debord's society of the spectacle, one that takes back from the spectacle the positive properties of being in language and being in common that it expropriates. For Agamben, whatever being is the mode of being in the coming community. Produced in capitalist spectacle, whatever being is a harbinger of a better future, one wherein the division held together in the unity of the spectacle is ultimately overcome. Because he wants to wrest transformations of human nature from their entrapment in the spectacle, Agamben suggests as an apposite image the geometrical splendor of the legs of a long line of dancing girls. Another way to think about the idea of neither generic nor individual is to link it to the normalizing, aggregating aspect of disciplinary power. Modern disciplinary institutions, be they home, school, factory, or state, produced individuals as types, as occupants of social roles or positions. Recall photographs of Levittown, of soldiers in training, of graduates in their caps and gowns. The self-governing, reflective subject idealized as the outcome of the disciplines may have understood himself to be an individual, but more than that, he was an instance of a form. Autonomy appeared through individuality. Agamben associates the planetary petty bourgeoisie with a frustration with and impropriety toward identities rooted in physical particularities or differences in language, tradition, or culture. He concedes that fascism and Nazism had already recognized in the petty bourgeoisie the decline of the old social subject. He jumps quickly over their nationalism as a false popular identity, though, as he asserts, a new planetary refusal of identity. With this jump, Agamben omits the mass as a modern collective force that is also neither generic nor individual. The mass is a displaced mediator between the planetary bourgeoisie and whatever being. In Jean Baudrillard's formulation, the mass is without attribute, predicate, quality, or reference. Agamben's whatever beings appear as singularizations of the mass. Bereft of qualities of their own, they are not the same as the mass resolved into its components. Masses were masses of subjects, combinations and aggregations and accumulations of people across and against modernity's attempts to separate and order them. If the mass results from a combination of bodies that omits their specificities, whatever being skips the step of amassing to treat the indistinction, the without qualities, not as a result of belonging to the mass but as the condition of belonging as such. Agamben's version of co-belonging inverts the political imaginary of radicals from the 60s and 70s. Many feared erasure, being commodified, being indistinguishable, being one of a mass. They rejected the terms of mass society and mass media, the forced collectivizing of their self-perception into the envelope of us. Agamben accepts the mass without its collective form, thereby reformatting the momentary joy of dissolution into a whole as the singularity of belonging. Whatever beings do not shed or overcome their identities in an experience of massness. They already lack them. They can simply be as they are. The mass is the missing link, displaced mediator, the function of which is a chiasmatic inversion of properties. Baudrillard writes, banality, inertia, apoliticism used to be fascist. They are in the process of becoming revolutionary, without changing meaning, without ceasing to have meaning. Baudrillard's warning to leftists in the 70s hits its target today. How is it that the evacuation of politics comes to embody the political as such? Nevertheless, for Agamben the petty bourgeoisie displays or stand in for the mass, presenting thereby a new opportunity, an opportunity for a form of belonging unhindered by the division and specificity of belonging to. Quotation by Agamben. Because if instead of continuing to search for a proper identity in the already improper and senseless form of individuality, humans were to succeed in belonging to this impropriety as such, in making of the proper being thus not an identity and an individual property but a singularity without identity, a common and absolutely exposed singularity, if humans could, that is, not be thus in this or that particular biography, but be only the thus, their singular exteriority and their face, then they would for the first time enter into a community without presuppositions and without subjects, into a communication with the incommunicable. End of quotation by Agamben. We have been produced as subjects unlikely to coalesce, subjects resistant to solidarity and suspicious of collectivity. Central to this production is the cultivation and feeding of a sense of unique and special individuality. Every sperm is sacred, so began the story of our unique cellular lives. Or, every potential genetic combination carries with it the remarkable potentiality we allocate in our individuated selves. Each voice must be heard, but they don't combine into a chorus. Each vote must be counted, but they add up to less than a movement. Each person must be visible, but then we don't see a group. Personalized participatory media is a problem not only because of its personalization of participation. More than that is its injunction that we participate ever more in personalization. Make your own avatar, video, profile, blog, mobster, video, app. Participation becomes indistinguishable from personalization, the continued cultivation of one's person. Leave your mark. What would happen if we just stopped? Agamben's evocation of singularity and belonging detached from a compulsion to cultivate an individual identity or to identify with a specific group opens up the potential for another form of belonging, one unlimited by the divisions and restrictions of being this or that. He suggests, moreover, that the beings who would so belong are not subjects in the sense that European philosophy or psychoanalysis might theorize. If some sort of identity served as a locus of ethical personality, and the search for this identity has been configured as an important ethical task, perhaps, as some philosophers would have it, the task of each human life, then whatever beings would emerge as those who are not subject to such tasks. Unburdened by the obligations of being this or that, of being bound by choices or words or expectations of meaning, whatever beings could flow into and through community without presuppositions. Agamben asks what the politics of whatever singularity could be, what sort of politics could accompany a being whose community is mediated not by any condition of belonging, being red, being Italian, being communist, but by belonging itself. Because the course of his exposition of whatever being takes him through St. Thomas Aquinas and limbo as the habitat of the souls of unbaptized children, the political question seems particularly vexing. Those in limbo lack God, but they don't suffer from this lack, they know nothing of it, neither blessed like the elected, nor hopeless like the damned, they are infused with a joy with no outlet. With limbo long synonymous with a certain stuckness, with an in-between condition of persistence that is neither here nor there, with an inability to go forward or back, it is difficult to register a politics that we might admire or seek. More specifically, I can locate here neither a politics I admire nor any sort of struggle at all. What could motivate whatever beings? What might move them? As Agamben conceives them, they seek nothing, they lack nothing. They co-belong without struggle or antagonism. It would seem, therefore, that they are not political beings at all, their being is apolitical, beyond politics. They neither attack nor resist, they are neither inside nor outside. Perhaps it makes better sense, then, to think of the politics of whatever beings in terms of their setting. They are moved and propelled, they circuit through contemporary networks. Souls in limbo belong in neither heaven nor hell. This condition of belonging to neither is also Agamben's model for a politics of absolute enmity toward the state. Agamben writes that a being radically devoid of any representable identity would be absolutely irrelevant to the state. And so the state, or, better, states would continue, unbothered and unlimited by the demands of people. States could attack and imprison, exploit and ignore, the future unfolding in and through militarized predatory robot drones. Whatever beings lack nothing and therefore demand nothing, and, presumably, they all get along just fine. No wonder they are irrelevant to the state. The state can do what it wills. Whatever. For Agamben, however, rather than easing the way for unchecked state power, whatever being is the principal enemy of the state. The state, he tells us, cannot tolerate in any way that the singularities form a community without affirming an identity, that humans go belong without any representable condition of belonging. Leaving to the side the question whether this intolerance is a property of the state or a more complex matter of a human subjectivity that is constitutively split, it seems clear enough that the state has from time to time tolerated and used the mass, a form of go-belonging without representable condition. The mass can threaten or support the state, can subvert or sustain it. In Baudrillard's conception, for example, the mass is neither a group subject nor an object. On the one hand, the mass generally fails to become a conscious revolutionary force. On the other, it refuses attempts to make it speak. Surveys and statistics may simulate it, but the mass remains ungraspable, particularly as these very surveys are implicated in the reflexive constitution of the mass they survey. The absence of the mass, Baudrillard says, is nevertheless intolerable. It drives the repetitive processes of polling and testing. So not only can and has the state tolerated forms of co-belonging that do not affirm an identity, but the absence of an identity can itself generate processes of surveillance and incitement to speech useful for producing and maintaining power. Agamben conceives the spectacle as language or communicativity. It is a form for the expropriation of linguistic being, a form that alienates people from language. He works here from the dilemma expressed by Debord. In the society of the spectacle, the language of real communication has been lost and a new common language has yet to be found. Quotation by Debord. Spectacular consumption preserves the old culture in congealed form, going so far as to recuperate and rediffuse even its negative manifestations. In this way, the spectacle's cultural sector gives over expression to what the spectacle is implicitly in its totality, the communication of the incommunicable. End of quotation by Debord. Agamben's response is to turn the problem into the solution and in so doing find in the spectacle a positive possibility that can be used against it. Communication of the incommunicable dissolves the gap between them. It tells us that even the incommunicable can be communicated, that it cannot be separated.
Thus,
the spectacle as the extreme expression of estrangement from linguistic being enables its own overcoming. The expropriation of language in the spectacle opens up a new experience of language and linguistic being, not this or that content of language, but language itself, not this or that true proposition, but the very fact that one speaks. Failure to communicate provides its own satisfaction, the enjoyment of language itself. In the first chapter, I discuss Zizek's account of drive as loss. Drive is loss as itself an object. Agamben's reflexive treatment of communication, his turn from what is said to that something is said, employs this logic of drive. Not only as a negative condition, estrangement from linguistic being, treated as a positive opening, new experience of belonging, but its positivity is a result of reflexivity. Language turns on itself. Encountering again the reflexive logic of drive, we get a better sense of whatever being, of why it is the kind of being it is. Insofar as whatever beings experience their own linguistic being, they turn their attention from the content of language, from trying to communicate something, back to themselves as speaking. They shift from focusing on something outside or beyond themselves to turning back round upon themselves. In his discussion of the drive as precisely this turning round upon the self, Freud views it as a change from activity to passivity. The active aim, to say something, is replaced by the passive aim, to have said. Whatever beings are passive, then, because they are subjects of drive. The very excesses of their communicative activity are the form of passivity. Construing drive as a movement outward and back, Lacan employs the image of the headless subject. This acephalic subject of drive has no relation to the subject other than one of topological community. Because drive involves but one surface or side of the subject, it isn't quite right to think of the subject of drive as actually a subject. Lacan says that at this level, we are not even forced to take into account any subjectification of the subject. We're considering a non-subjectivized subject, one characterized primarily by a lacuna, something is missing, the head. In fact, Lacan refers to the subject here as a lacunary apparatus, an apparatus that makes holes or that makes things turn up missing. The term apparatus suggests that this side of the subject, the side of the drive, is better conceived as an object. Lacan's term for this object that provides the other side or fundamental support for the subject is objet petit, or loss itself as an object. Whatever beings are set in the society of the spectacle, within the conditions of the alienation of language, they are effects of this expropriation of the commons, of a loss of meaning, difference, and individuality that turns this loss into their condition of belonging. Their setting is one of the perfect exteriority that communicates only itself. Their setting is the reflexive loop of drive. Section 9. To formalize the ways language provides a set of social links, Lacan presents formulas for 4 discourses, those of the master, the hysteric, the university, and the analyst. Each discourse takes its name from the figure that occupies the position of the agent that speaks in that discourse. Thus, the upper level of the discourse of the analyst is written $, objet A in the position of agent, subject bud in the position of addressee. The lower level is written S2, S1, knowledge or the chain of signifiers in the position of truth and the master signifier in the position of product or remainder. This lower level sits directly below the upper level such that A is written above S2 and $, is on top of S1. Zizek explains that in the discourse of the analyst stands for the paradox of the desubjectivized subject, of the subject who fully assumes what Lacan calls subjective destitution, that is, who breaks out of the vicious cycle of the intersubjective dialectic of desire, and turns into an acephalous being of pure drive. He concludes that the discourse of the analysis should therefore be correlated to radical revolutionary emancipatory politics. Insofar as the analyst just sits there in the analytic situation, frustrating the poor subject by failing to provide it with a clear, symbolic place, the analyst is a part that is not a part of the situation. Zizek takes the term part of no part from Jacques Rancière. After all, that's why the analyst is paid, to function as an outside intrusion into the subject's life. But what about a different reading of the formula of the analyst's discourse? Lacan notes that the analyst says to the subject, "Off you go, say everything that comes into your head, however divided it might be, no matter how clearly it demonstrates that either you are not thinking or else you are nothing at all, it may work, what you produce will always be admissible." What if we insert this injunction to say whatever comes to mind in the Blodgepelago? What if we think of the social link of the discourse of the analyst as set within a declining symbolic order, an order which is barely ordered, where meaning slips and slides, getting momentarily stuck on nuggets of enjoyment? If the discourse of the analysis is set within the decline of symbolic efficiency, then at least three things follow. First, the subject is desubjectivized or destitute. It is not structured in terms of symbolic identification, so the analyst isn't functioning primarily as a marker of the gap in the symbolic. The instability of the symbolic has already been assumed, or the symbolic is so riddled with holes and gaps that they no longer appear as gaps of the real cannot appear as such. Second, the object confronting and splitting the subject is itself a surplus enjoyment confronting and splitting the subject, threatening its fragile sense of itself. The stability of the master is in the position of remainder. We have entered the domain of drive, rather than desire. The analyst isn't only a figure of drive, then. The discourse as such persists in drive. Set in drive, the formula for the discourse of the analyst can be read as a formula for whatever being. The objet addresses a subject. It sends a message, it attempts to connect. Knowledge is in the position of truth, S2 under the bar. But this knowledge is anything whatsoever. Any sort of content or knowledge can support the agent/speaking object. Experience, mysticism, common sense, my gut, my opinion, in the absence of expertise, in the place of the decline of trust in so-called expert knowledge, I can use anything as a support for my view, fully aware that the fact that anything can be used actually means nothing can fully ground my position. This problem of any authority whatsoever appears in the formula, S1, the master, is below the bar, under the subject, in the position of production or remainder. Authority is remaindered, present but inoperative, unable to establish meaning. In the setting of the decline of symbolic efficiency, the part of no part is not radical. It doesn't establish a break with the situation because there is not a situation that can be set or established as such. There is also no space for fantasy. The formula for fantasy does not appear. Whatever being doesn't allow for fantasy, it is premised on its foreclosure. Section 10. Contemporary networked media perform and repeat communicativity as such, the taking place of language, as applications for the expression of any idea whatsoever, of an opinion, such that it is. Blogs continue the severing of expressions from their content and their authors. Ideas and opinions link together and circulate, expressions of themselves neither completely generic nor completely individual. Posts may link and gesture, but they don't represent themselves or anything else. They are expressions, such that they are. The measuring and counting, the hits and rankings, remind bloggers that we are set in intensive, reflexive, communication and entertainment networks. It's as if the compulsion to make the mass speak, to poll and survey it, now takes whatever being as its target. Blog stats don't track truth or meaning. They track blogging, the addition of posts, responses, and page views. Differently put, they track the fact of the spoken as they direct us away from what is said. A better instance of language without referent, of language that refers only to the it was said, is the word cloud, a graphic representation of the content of a text understood in terms of frequency of word use. For example, a word cloud made following the first debate between presidential candidates John McCain and Barack Obama during the 2008 election shows that McCain frequently used the words no, spending, and got. Obama used the words think, make, and going. He also used the word got with high frequency. We don't know what this means. But we do know that words were used and speeches were made. The irony here is that language is language itself, language reflected to itself as language. Agamben's ideal of the coming community takes the spectacular form of the image. In word clouds, frequency and proximity displace meaning. Which words appear with which other words? The combination of these elements determines intensity. Words that appear only once either don't count, they aren't counted, or they appear very faint and tiny, type as atmosphere. Words matter, not stories and not narratives. Words index communication, they mark that they are being communicated. Word clouds shift away from a space of linguistically constituted meaning, away from a language constituted out of sentences that are uttered in contexts according to rules that can be discerned and contested. What's lost? The ability to distinguish between contestatory and hegemonic speech. Irony. Tonality. Normativity. How can there be an ethics of the address if the words are not part of an address, if they are extracted from their position within speech acts to become artifacts and toys? Critique. The terms prominent in a discourse can be discerned, but not what they mean, not even in relation to each other. We don't know the rules governing truth and falsity, which may suggest that there are no rules, other than those of frequency, proximity, and duration. Note that frequency can be citational or monological, that is, it can come from circulation or from self-repetition. Message force multipliers are more important than the message. Word clouds capture the shift from message to contribution characteristic of communicative capitalism. The word image of the word cloud is prefigured in avant-garde art from the late 19th and early 20th century. Cubists included words as images. Even more disruptive were the posters from Russian communist and Soviet revolutionary artists. On the one hand, their word art was effective because of its revolutionary impulse, its challenge to the status quo of late Russian painting. It performed the revolution, disrupting prior meanings. On the other, precisely because it depended on its context for its performative efficacy, it reinforced the fact of symbolic meaning. Its disruption was not only to index language but to create a new one, to bring about a new world, a new man, a new register of meaning. The point wasn't to destroy meaning. It was to change it. Word clouds aren't revolutionary. They are elements of communicative capitalism, elements that reinforce the collapse of meaning and argument and thus hinder argument and opposition. Any words can be clouded. At Wordle you can make a new one out of speeches from Kennedy and Khrushchev, Ann Coulter or Sean Puffy Combs. Anyone you like. The word cloud image doesn't stand in for or provide a prosthetic word. It marks a feeling, an intensity. It doesn't ask that the viewer understand it. All the viewer is expected to do is register that the word has been, that it has appeared. The word become image is a feeling impulse, like a badge. It's identificatory, relying on an identity between word and object. The word image is this impulse identity. One can't argue with the word cloud. It doesn't take a position. It marks a moment. It registers aspects of the intensity of that moment. Repetition entails intensity in this equation. But one doesn't know why or whether it's called for or what it's in relation to. It's just intense. The word cloud might transmit the intensity, it might incite a feeling or a response, but it doesn't invite the interrogation of that response or what induced it. It offers representation without understanding. Issues are out there. A word cloud is like a Mobius strip where metadata become noise. She said a lot about politics and technology. Whatever.